Hey guys, welcome back to Nadir Audio. Today we're going to be taking a look at my vintage Kenwood KR-820 stereo receiver that I bought new way back in 1983. So this was my main stereo receiver from 1983 to some point in the early 90s, I think around 1992. I replaced it with another receiver, but I've always had a soft spot for this little guy. I did like the way he sounds, and I think he looks pretty cool. He's got that brushed metal look from the 70s and early 80s that I always liked. And so I just couldn't bear to part with him. So I've kept him in his original box, and I've just kind of taken him with me from place to place as I've moved over the years. And it wasn't until last year that I hooked him up in this little vintage entertainment system I have in the corner of my office. I didn't have any other amp to use here, and I just wanted to be able to play old games, watch old VHS tapes, old media, that kind of stuff. And I hooked it up to a pair of ELAC B5s, and it sounded fine. It wasn't great. I have other vintage systems I like better, but I thought, well, this works for its purpose. And it actually wasn't until recently that I was swapping things around to set up a 2-channel home theater in the living room, which I'll go over in a future video. So I swapped out the speakers, and I put in this pair of Pioneer SPB 522 LRs that I had lying around. And strangely enough, the synergy between this and the Pioneers was a lot better than with the Kenwood and the ELACs. This little system actually sounds pretty good. Now, it's still, with some caveats, it's still a receiver of its time, and we'll talk about that a little in the video, but I think with this setting, it works a lot better. So obviously here in the office, it's not a great setup. We've got the speakers up on the shelves, and one of the speakers is sort of in a corner. But I did bring this whole setup into my listening room briefly, put it on the speaker stand, set up everything so it was optimal, and did some listening, which we'll talk about a little later in the video as well. But yeah, it's actually a better system than what I thought it was going to be. So this wasn't actually the first stereo I ever spent a lot of time with. That would be my parents' Fisher 150 system. If you haven't checked out my other video on that, I'll include a link in the description below. But that was the first stereo I ever heard, and that was the one that I just spent tons of hours in the 70s when I was a little kid listening to. But by the early 80s, I kind of wanted to get a stereo system on my own, something I could listen to in my room, and I was looking for something with a different sound signature. Now, in that other video I mentioned how my parents' Fisher system had kind of an A-curve sound, which actually is really pleasant to listen to now, but at the time I was looking for something much different. I wanted more treble, more bass. I wanted kind of that more neutral and sort of lean and clear sound that you would get from the stereos of the era, and that I was hearing from some of my friends' stereo systems. So the only barriers at that time, one was money. I didn't have much money, and two was I wasn't old enough to drive, so I could only go to places that my parents were going to already. So I solved the first problem by starting a little lawn mowing business back then. My grandfather very graciously gave me his old Lawn Boy lawnmower, and I started mowing some of the neighbors' yards and some of the yards in my grandparents' neighborhood, and making a little bit of money. And then the second issue with the driving, actually where I grew up in Kansas, you could get a learner's permit when you were 14, and I turned 14 in 1983. So you really were only supposed to use that to drive to school or if somebody was in the car, but my dad would let me take his car on occasion and go to places, so I started being able to go to stereo stores. But before that point, all the research I did for stereos was kind of done just by going to stores with my parents and family. And one of the places that I always used to like to go to was Service Merchandise. So this is actually a Service Merchandise catalog from 1982, 1983. And they were just kind of a general purpose catalog store. They had a little bit of everything, but they also sold stereo equipment. So every time we'd go, I'd hustle over to the stereo department. And because at that time my budget was really limited, around $200 or just a little more was all I could really spend for this initial purchase. And so I definitely considered some of these kind of all-in-one systems. Like here's a Panasonic system here for $219, and I remember looking at these and considering them for a while. But they also had, real stereo, separate stereo components here at Service Merchandise. So Here are some Techniques receivers from the time, and here's a 30-watt one for $219. So it looks like you could find things that were just in my price range, but you know, that doesn't include speakers or anything, any kind of a source. That's basically just the unit. At this time, there was one other place I used to go to, which was called CMC Stereo, which was kind of a dedicated stereo chain. We had them in the Midwest, and my friend's mom would sometimes drive us there after school to buy blank cassettes starting in the late 70s. So that's how I knew about this place, and then when I was able to drive, I went over there and checked it out, and that's actually where I ended up buying this. And I remember it was on sale for $220, which was all the money I had, and I could just barely pay for it with tax. But I did manage to pick it up and bring it home, and actually I couldn't afford speakers for another 6 months. So for the first few months I had this, I was mainly just listening to the radio, and I was listening using my dad's Pioneer headphones through the headphone jack. I didn't even have speakers for it. Now I did, about 6 months later, I was able to afford a pair of Kenwood LD40. They were sort of these two-way speakers with passive radiators. They also went on sale at CMC. I think it was $50 for the pair, so $25 a piece. And then once I finally had my speakers, then I was really, that was great. I had my own stereo, I could listen to it. And then later on in 1984, I was able to save up and get a cassette deck, which I really wanted. And actually that's available in this, I actually think I got it at Service Merchandise. It's that one on the bottom there, the Akai GXF31, which is actually a great cassette deck, and maybe we'll talk about that in a future video. But this was really the beginning of my sort of stereo journey, and yeah, I was actually very happy with this at the time, and I thought it compared well to some of my friends' systems. I thought it had actually very nice sound when coupled with those LD40s, which was just kind of really cheap low-end speakers. But then I've held on to this over the years, just mainly out of nostalgia. It was my main stereo until the early 90s, and I actually replaced it with another receiver, not because I really wanted to, but because the tuner on this unit actually only works intermittently, and it's been that way since around 92, 93. Now, one of the reasons I made this video today is I just happened to turn this thing on and the tuner was working. So I was like, oh, great. Why don't we make a video while we can see the tuner? I think that'll make it more interesting. But yeah, let's take a closer look at the unit itself. So the KR-820 is a 33-watt stereo receiver. We have speaker A and speaker B selectors over here, so you can have a remote set of speakers if you want. Then we have the AM/FM tuner section, which on this unit works only intermittently, but it's working at the moment. We've got 6 presets, so that's 6 FM and 6 AM, and you can save those with the memory button down here. And then we have the scan up and down, which you can turn off the scan, so you can do a manual tuning. And then we have the FM mode, which can be put into mono as well if you're having trouble picking up a station. And that's it. It's a real simple little tuner. Then we have our basic tone controls. We have the bass, treble, balance. We have a high filter button, which I never use. We have a loudness button, which is actually very handy when you're listening at low volumes. Makes it sound a lot better. And then we have our source selectors. So that's the thing about this receiver that's a little different. We have our AM and FM, and then a phono selector over here on the right. And one of these three has to be selected at all times. And then we also have our tape B auxiliary, and then there's also a tape A. And then you can do dubbing from B to A using it as a tape monitor. But what's unusual is that these tape buttons are completely independent of these. So one of these 3 sources is selected at all times, even if you're listening to the tape input. And because this does tend to have some problems with the tuner, I usually just leave it in the phono stage, in which case you just get this little green light up. So that keeps the tuner off when you're not using it, and saves it so that it can continue to work for as long as possible. So that's really it. It's funny, on the front it says computerized high-speed stereo receiver. So everything in the early 80s was computerized, and what that basically meant was that it was built around a printed circuit board rather than having discrete electronics like in older units. So yeah, let's take a quick look inside. Okay, so not too much to see here on the back. We have our inputs and outputs. Over on the right we have our speaker connections. Those are those kind of twist type, which are kind of a pain to use, but all of these old receivers, at least the entry-level ones, kind of have this system similar to this, so you just kind of have to live with it. We have a couple outlets if you want to chain this with other components. Over on the left we have our antenna connections, and you can see I have an adapter so I can attach a modern FM antenna with a coax connection. But that's really all there is to it. And then inside you can see we just have a whole mess of PCBs. So I can see a few, at least on the tuner unit, there's an IC here. It's a Toshiba TC9137P. Don't know exactly what that does. We've got our modest power supply back here. If you look underneath the tuner board, it may be difficult to see, but there's a couple of capacitors there for the power supply. We've got a fuse in here that we've never used. We've got a bunch of spider webs. Normally if I was going to be looking at one of these I would clean it out, but since this guy has been with me for almost the last 40 years, I figure all this crud has kind of come along with this, so I'll just leave it for now unless I have to get in here to actually fix something at some point. And we can see we have another PCB over here, and then there's a PCB for the tone controls, one for the volume control. We got a kind of an inexpensive potentiometer hooked up to that. So definitely, you know, built to a price and pretty common for the stuff at the time, but you know, it's held up, aside from the tuner, it's held up pretty well and still sounds pretty good. So I think we'll leave that for now and put this thing back together. So overall I was pretty happy with the sound of this unit. I'd say it's slightly above average for the sort of entry-level 80s era receivers that I've heard in the past. It has kind of that typical sound signature, but it adds just a little bit of warmth and body, which I think helps set it apart a little bit. So while I had it in the music room, I listened to a few different recordings. I listened to an album called The Mosaic of Transformation by Kaitlyn Aurelia Smith. And this is a really cool recording. She's an electronic artist I have only known about for a short time. She plays mostly the bukla, which is sort of an early 70s electronic instrument. And this is a really cool album, and it was very enjoyable to listen to with the Kenwood hooked up to the Pioneer speakers. So I also listened to John Coltrane's Love Supreme. And I picked that recording because I feel like sometimes on receivers from this era, the drums on that particular recording can sound a little bit like they're not real, sort of toy-like, I would say, not fully three-dimensional. And I feel like this was actually able to capture the drum sound pretty well as the texture of Coltrane's horn. And in general, that also worked out really well. Now I did listen to a little classical. I listened to this Decca Recordings album by the pianist Behzad Abdurrahmov, and this is kind of a collection of different composers. It's mostly Prokofiev, but there's a little bit of Liszt and Saint-Saëns. And here is where it was enjoyable to listen to, but it wasn't quite getting all the complexity of the piano sound nor the room sound. And this is also kind of where this somewhat limited soundstage makes it a little less enjoyable than listening to this like on a modern audiophile system. So that was one where it was just okay, not great. I listened to Joni Mitchell's Court and Spark, which is a very produced mid-70s recording, and it sounded great with that. And then I did also listen to some of my favorite tracks from the Audiophiliac MA Recordings sampler. And I don't have any recordings that sound better than those recordings. They're just great at getting a really good room sound with just a couple of mics. And the Kenwood actually did surprisingly well. It did a lot better than I think it would be capable of with these Pioneer speakers. So I was pretty impressed. Now I will mention, you know, I'm kind of rating it based on what it is. It doesn't. When you listen to you know, either my PS Audio Sprout or my Ryzong A10 tube amp with the LS50s, it's a whole different ball game where you get kind of a full size you know, sound stage, and you get there are a lot more resolving, so you get a lot more details, and the bass is better. But you know, I'd say that the Kenwood has pretty decent bass, not super controlled, but it's, you know, it's there and it's enough. It's natural sounding enough that you can enjoy it. It has enough of the high-end detail that you can enjoy it. But really, you know, it's that sound stage where it's just kind of limited to a shallow plane behind the speakers, and it's limited to just behind the two speakers. It doesn't extend to the right or the left of the speakers. It doesn't really have any depth backwards, and it also doesn't really have any depth up and down, so it's almost like the performers are up on a high stage or something. So it's not the same experience as it is going with slightly more audiophile gear. But that said, I think it's very pleasant. If you just want to enjoy listening to music, I think this particular combination would do better than you might expect it to. So, but anyway, for me, you know, it's mainly just a nostalgia thing. This was my first receiver, and I'm kind of happy that it still holds up well enough that I can enjoy it. So yeah, that's really it this time, guys. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.